evening. I'd like to call to order this special town council meeting for April 28th, 2014. This is a budget workshop meeting. We'll rise for a moment of silence. We'll have the Pledge of Allegiance. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Thank you. Fishbein.
Here.
Laffin.
Here.
Letourneau.
Here.
Mansfield.
Here.
Parisi.
Here.
Russo.
Here.
Sullivan. Testa.
Here.
Chairman Cervoni.
Here, Councilor Sullivan has advised me that he has a work commitment this evening. And we will start with page 26, Personnel. Good evening, gentlemen. Please remind us who you are for the record.
Yes, good evening. My name is Jim Hutt. I'm the Acting Personnel Director.
Kurt Treiber, Risk Manager.
You got promoted.
Thank you. Do you have any preliminary remarks of any sort, or you just want to go right to the questions?
Well, we're prepared to answer your questions, so we can get right into that if you like.
All right. Thank you. Questions for these gentlemen? We're still on page 26, Pensions. Councilor Fishbein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, gentlemen.
Yes, good evening.
I'm looking at line 56784, Purchase Services, Claims Administration, and I noticed that there's a requested increase that was approved by the mayor. The $5,000 increase, what would you attribute that to?
That's a contractual increase. What that line item is it's our third-party administrator that handles the workers' compensation program. We have a 5-year bid with them. We're currently in year 3. Year 4 calls for a $5,000 increase. And then year 5, the price is level at the $125. So
Okay,
that's just
so it's 120 for the first 3 years, 125 for the
Correct.
next 2 years.
correct.
Thank you. I note that you had requested a copier, a $7,000 expenditure, and that doesn't appear to have been approved by the mayor unless that's one of these other like hidden things.
I can explain that. When we met with the mayor, we had the copier machine was put in the budget for 14-15, and the copier's old. It's on an 8-year cycle, and we asked if we could purchase out of this fiscal year. So last council meeting, you approved the transfer in the amount of $7,000.
Okay, so that was like the $1,000 that we dealt with last week for the dryer. That was the $7,000. Okay. Can I, in the future, is there some way that we can notate that stuff in this book so that?
It depends upon the timing. If it isn't reviewed until, we're working on the budget virtually at times on the last day. So it depends upon when those judgments are made and when it goes on the town council. It would be difficult to promise it's going to be in the book. Certainly we can tell you when it's coming in a regular meeting that this is something requested in the budget, but I don't know that we can put it in the book.
That would be helpful also, because we go through this every year with the stuff that you're using other funds like CRA funds or surplus from the prior years, and then it appears in the book, and we certainly know about that.
Well, that's because it's been requested by the department. We don't like to change what the department requested.
But if it's been approved, if we could just have an asterisk or something like that, so that we know, because we all ask these questions.
Yeah, I don't think we can put it in the budget, that's all. Because it depends upon when the decision is made. There's no way, it certainly, some of those items are in the letter that I prepared.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. The items that were in the letter are an example like this, and
Right,
why couldn't those just be you know, like a star.
The ones that
or
are in the
something like
letter are in the letter in order to alert anyone, the reader, that those items, even though requested elsewhere, are being funded in another manner.
that. So then we have to go search for where they are within the budget.
Well, the letter isn't that long.
Okay, well, sometimes the list is, but, okay. Now, am I to understand, Mr. Chairman, that, because on our agenda, tonight's agenda has page numbers, but this is the first time that we're getting page numbers, that the pension fund is something different than, I mean, this tab is personnel and pension.
We've had page numbers on every agenda that's been on the desk when we've
The
gotten.
desk.
Yeah.
Yes, but the ones that I've gotten prior to coming to the desk tonight, when I prepare for tonight at home, the one of these that I get does not have page numbers on it.
That's correct.
Okay, so when I'm preparing at home and I'm tabbing my book in preparation for this meeting, we have an entry that says pensions on the agenda for tonight. I have two tabs that say pensions. Am I to understand that we aren't dealing with the pension fund tonight? We're just dealing with personnel and pensions? Is that,
I believe we typically deal with the pension fund on the comptroller's evening. So that will be in a few, tomorrow night.
okay, only because,
If I may, the personnel office, the personnel director, administers the pension plan from a benefit side. So the calculations, or the amounts requested on page 27 in the budget binder come from personnel. So Mr. Hutt is the appropriate person.
I know the division of power. I just, looking at how we got the budget book, pension fund is in the middle of the stuff that we're dealing with tonight, ergo my question, because all I had was a list saying we were dealing with pensions tonight. That's all.
Yeah, and tonight, if there's
Question
any
is
other.
answered.
Okay.
Thank you. That's all I had for this tab. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Testa?
So that means we're not talking about the pension fund tonight, right?
You gleaned correctly.
Okay, I'm quite a gleaner. Okay. Just curious, regarding the personnel department, this might be a question for the mayor. Hold on.
If I can just, I'm totally confused about the questioning. Personnel handles pensions.
We're talking about funding the pension, though.
And the number that is in the book for funding pensions would be the number that comes through personnel. I don't understand the question, I really don't.
Why don't the council members ask their questions, and it, regardless of who handles it, Mr. Hutt or myself tonight?
My question was essentially, are we dealing with page 27 tonight?
Okay. Yep. You would be, yes, because that's Mr. Hutt's,
All right, well, it's not on our agenda. I thought it was going to be.
oh, I understand, it's not on the agenda. It's on my calendar, so I don't know if it was on the original one that came out, the original schedule. It's not on the original calendar? I have it on my calendar upstairs, and, but in my view, you should deal with it tonight if it comes to anything that you're requesting for page 27.
Well, then if it will make your life easier, we'll deal with it tonight.
Well, no,
And
if
if
there's
there's any-
questions, I'm not trying to make my life easier, I'm just saying if there is something that, with regards to the calculations of the pages 20, that's on page 27, that's personnel, so you may be prolonging your own look at it, but that's up to you folks, obviously. As far as the pension commission, I can try to answer questions on that, the investments and things of that nature. But the calculation of the amounts that get funded into the plan are personnel for the charter.
Yeah, the primary thing on pensions is what we're paying to meet the actuaries. That is the principal, one of the principal jobs, duties of the personnel department. You know, I would suggest that just don't rely on page numbers. The subject matter is the key. Right, I realize, but use the subject matter as the key to what is being discussed. Because yes, some of these items can appear on multiple pages, one angle or issue than another. However, the subject matter pension is what controls. So anything regarding pensions would be.
Councilor Fishbein, if you have more questions about the fund, we'll come back to you.
Yes, thank you. I was just surprised when I sat down here today and I saw page 27 wasn't on the agenda. And that's-
Understood.
Thank you.
Councilor Testa, the floor is still yours.
Okay. I'm still gleaning.
You may have to
Question,
re-clean.
yeah, it's a question for the mayor, pretty much. Do you, I understand, well, do you have a timeline that whereby the actual personnel director and assistant personnel director positions would be filled, since we are budgeting over $200,000 for both positions for the year?
As soon as possible. And at this point, it could happen fairly quickly. It depends on other factors.
Is it safe to assume that by the time this budget year begins, it'll be pretty darn close to that at least?
I would hope so.
Yeah, so it doesn't make any sense to adjust the amounts because we're going to expect both these positions to be filled.
We need them both, right?
I knew that, I just
Yeah.
figured if,
No, it's not, it's going to take
Looked
as
like there
little
was gonna
time
be a-
as possible.
if there would be a 6-month delay, we could save $100,000 here. All right, that's it on that one. Would questions be appropriate regarding the pension contribution at this time?
Go ahead.
Are we on that point? Well, I guess my question is,
Chairman, are we on page 27 then?
yeah, I am. Thank you.
Per Councilor Testa's indication.
Yes, if that's okay.
Thank you.
I can wait.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, we're looking at just under 5 million for fiscal year 2013 actual. We are, there's an adjustment obviously for this current budget year to about 5.8, and now we're going to be recommended 6.5, approved 6.4. I would just ask for an explanation on that.
Sure. When we put together the budget, we go through the payrolls from the previous fiscal year, the fiscal year that we're in right now, and then we project out what we anticipate payroll costs to increase. And then when the mayor and Jim Bowes meets with department heads, at the conclusion of those meetings, Jim provides me with the personnel detail with all funded positions. And then from there, I'm able to extrapolate what our total pension contribution is going to be. We revise the figures up or down based on that.
And that's based on a percentage that's advised, or that's provided by the actuary,
That's correct.
correct? And what is that?
For this fiscal year, it's recommended at 20% of payroll.
20% of payroll? Now, how is that compared to, say, the last 3 or 4 years?
This current year, we're 18.7. The previous year was 18%.
And what was their rationale for increasing that?
Well, our liabilities go up. People accrue more benefits as the years go on. Now, this also includes, payroll from the Board of Education. So we're looking at increased number of participants, which also include the Board of Education. So as the years go on, the liability increases, people earn bigger benefits, and it also reflects additional personnel that may be hired by the Board of Ed.
Does it also reflect, or how does it reflect the performance of the pension funds over the last couple of years? Or does it at all? I mean, I'm trying to get an idea what the philosophy is here,
I guess I don't understand the point of your question. Are you saying that the contributions have an effect on the performance of the assets in the fund?
No, vice versa. Has the historical performance over the last few years of the fund played a role in the actuarial calculations as to what
Yes,
and-
well,
and-
yes, all returns would play a role, yes.
And what are the, does how would I word this? Like, do any philosophical assumptions come into play with what the actuary tells us?
Actuarial assumptions are made, yes, there's a, yes.
Well, I mean, what are they? I mean, in other words, does he say, is our town's position, we want to be fully funded or a percent funded by X, et cetera, et cetera? Where does that roll in?
An actuarial calculation always calculates you to reach 100% funding. That's part of what goes into the calculation of what
Okay.
gets funded. There are methodologies that actuaries utilize under their professional standards to help you reach that. And I'm going to ask Jim Hutt to jump in if I misspeak, that are referred to as basically smoothing techniques, whereby you don't really recognize the full extent of gains or losses to their fullest extent in the period in which they occur, and instead they are smoothed out over the next several fiscal years. And do we use 5 or 10 year smoothing? I'm not sure, but either way, it is so that to try to avoid, I'll call them spikes in the expenditure budget. But yes, they use a technique which they call smoothing.
I think part of the issue is that we weren't making any real headway against the unfunded liability, so it requires increased contribution in order to do that. Another factor is what the assumption is on the interest, the gains. And Jim, we went from what, 8% to?
I think it was, I think.
We lowered our
Yeah, I
expectation.
think it went to like 7%.
7.6
Yeah.
is our annual
Somewhere around there.
rate of return expectation right now.
The report was that a lot of towns have adjusted that because it's not meeting expectations. That ultimately affects how you, or when you begin to cut into the unfunded liability. So,
Could you clarify, what do you mean by unfunded liability?
well, if we're 70% funded or thereabouts, you want to try to begin to cut into that 30% that you're unfunded. And if you're just holding even or barely holding even, that's not a good scenario.
The actuaries compute the benefits that every person employed, retired, or those who are vested and will retire, what their liability would be based upon their work-life experience as well as their expected life based upon mortality tables, which, by the way, life expectancy just increased by about 6 months or 8 months based upon the last actuarial table that came out. So that kind of, well, it helps us all because we live a
That's
little longer,
promising,
but
yeah.
it hurts the computation. But so basically, and what they do is they roll that back to what would happen on June 30th, the balance sheet date, if the town, what is that amount approximately that the town would have to pay, or what was its liability at June 30th of that year? Let's say it was $100 million, and we were funded at, let's say, $72 million, because I believe we're about 72% funded, the last actuarial. I believe that's where we are. And those numbers, by the way, are just made up just to make the math simple.
I understand.
It's basically a goal of 100%. That is the standard. You never reach it, obviously. Sometimes you're over 100%. I know there were times back in the mid-90s, early 2000s, I should say mid to late 90s, when this plan was funded at 112%, 113%, which means you were 12 or 13%, and I'll use a horrible phrase, overfunded. Not that you want to use that phrase, but in other words, your assets exceeded the liabilities by the 100% of the liabilities by 12 or 13%. So it's always a target that is unreachable, whether you do very well or whether you do poorly. The last couple of years, the assets have returned 19.2% last year, and I believe 18% or 17% the year before. So we've done the assets are performing well. The asset level is at it's at a level that the folks that have worked here for a long time have never seen. We're at about 164, $165 million in assets under management. And lately, they've been, we've been turning around a pretty good rate of return. However, what's happened is when the market collapsed in 2008, as everybody recalls, most plans, you want to call them DB plans especially, had losses somewhere in the 30%, 35% range. Ours, we lost about 22, 23%, if I remember correctly, just in that year. We were a little bit more conservative than some plans that were out there, so we fared a little bit better. If you can call losing 22% faring better. But, so it took several years just to get back to that base to begin with, which we are and well over now. I think that base fell from about 140 million down to maybe like 110 million, give or take, back in 2008. We're now at the 160, well, depending on the markets today, let's say 162, 164 million dollars in assets. But what has happened over that 7-year or 6-year time, and now 7 years, what Mr. Hutt is projecting in the budget here, is that you've had 7 more years of liabilities accruing. That's the first thing that's happened. Mortality has increased. I should say the lack of mortality has increased by several months. And people might not think that that's not such a big deal, but if everybody's life expectancy goes up six months or so, and you extrapolate that among, hundreds of retirees and potential retirees, that benefit calculation increases dramatically. And also, we are experiencing, I don't know, maybe Jim's got a better term for it, an aging of our work population. Folks who are at their top steps are staying longer, mostly because of things like healthcare and things of that nature. And instead of retiring a little bit more robustly, which then brings folks down at the lower earning steps, which of course affects the calculation that you're seeing on page 27 because it's at a lower base. Even if you've got 2 dozen or 3 dozen employees who are still at the top level, who are not replaced by folks at the lowest level, and that differential and that 20% or the 18% on that differential is a big component of that number as well. So it's a many-faceted thing, and I'm probably skipping a dozen of them, but that's basically where the fund has gone over the last two or three years. The assets have performed well. We realigned a little bit. We think we're a little more conservative than most funds, but still getting some of the returns that we are really happy with. But the liability side of it, the pension board has, nothing to do with that. And the fact, I think a lot of people took a financial hit in 2008, whether they had outside savings accounts, IRAs and things of that nature, and a lot of insecurity. Folks who maybe were in the later 50s, early 60s, who might have retired before age 65, are sticking around. We've got quite a few people that way that fit into that category. I'm sorry for that long answer.
No, I understand. Although you did say one thing that made my ears perk up. You mentioned 19%. What was that about?
90%.
You said our assets had a return of 19%.
Last calendar year, we did 19.2%.
That was the return on investment of our investment.
Yes.
I thought you said was 8.
No,
That's the
that's our
assumption.
that's one of the actuarial assumptions is 8% per year. That's one factor that goes into the generation of the accrued liability at year end, which then gets further calculated down the road as to
Right.
how much we should.
Well, that's what I'm.
We don't change. Going back about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, I believe there has been a trend in the defined benefit plans, as strongly recommended by actuaries, for plan sponsors to look at and evaluate the actuarial assumptions that they're using as far as the expected rates of return. 8% has been kind of a standard bearer for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's an average 8%.
I understand.
You lose 20% one year, hopefully gain that back in a few years. So when it averages down, it averages to 8. Probably, from what I've been told, is because that they don't see the average annual rate of 8% going forward into the future. So they've been strongly recommending their clients to take another look at their rates, their anticipated rates of return, and we reduced ours to 7.6%, which increases the amount that you're seeing on page 27
Yes,
potentially
I understand.
in the short term.
Right.
But there were years, 2008 and afterwards, we weren't making 8%. And
Right.
now you don't make up that money unless you're making significantly higher returns, which lately has been better, but it's not a continual
I know, and
continual
we do this,
history.
and we do this year to year. They calculate year to year. When we have got I mean, I'm stunned to hear that, and I'm pleased to hear that we've seen a return of 19%.
It's the liability side, Vin, that's really.
Well, yeah, I understand. Yeah, I mean, and
really
then they
kicking
say,
us-
guys, pull back a little bit on your assumptions, but I mean, 1% on this fund is, I know it compounds. I mean, that's
Sure.
It's almost $2 million. It's $1 million. It's at 1.8, $1.6 million, 1.5, whatever it is. And I've brought this up in years past. I'm not looking to be irresponsible, but excuse me. When our budget is as tight as it is, and we're working on these assumptions, and yet we have a year which is so tremendous, and we could potentially pull back and say, well, gee, let's not raise it another 600,000 this year. Let's not raise it another million. Let's stick with what we did this year. And certainly, if our returns start to come down a little bit, and if we only get 12% or 15% based on the track record you have in the last year, that's still a lot better than the 7 or 8 that you're being told to budget for. That's the only reason I'm trying to get clarification on some of
No,
this.
we're not budgeting for 8%. We're budgeting in order to meet all of the needs of the pension plan. At the point we depart from the actuary, you're at a point of no return. The actuaries follow their standards. They are the ones who, certainly credit rating agencies or anyone else reviewing the books, are going to ask, what did your third-party objective people say you should do? And if you don't do that, now you've got a major question, because at the point you don't follow that advice and you're further in the hole, you'll never recover. It's like the 2008 hit. We haven't recovered. We're not going to recover what was lost. I mean, I think right now perhaps we're slightly above where we were then, but it's taken how many years? And that means you're still behind, because all that time you should have had that growth that was in there, you haven't had it. So once we depart from the actuary, you are in a never-never land, and at that point anyone has a legitimate argument to say, you're not doing what's appropriate because your expert has told you to do this and you did something else.
I appreciate that perspective. I've asked in years past, present to the actuary a scenario, ask them for what their view of that is, what would be the difference. Does that take our projected fully funded date out a year or two instead of wherever it's planning on being, given that we're getting good returns now? I'm not asking to say, heck with the actuary, let's do whatever we want, and, well, whatever. I've asked my questions. I'm all set. Thanks.
Thank you. Up next is Councilor Letourneau.
Good evening. On line 52300, LoSAP for volunteer fire department, there's been an increase of just over 10,000. Could you explain that line?
Yes, that's the
Page
actual.
27.
Yes, that's the actuarial recommendation for contribution for the LoSAP.
Okay. What is the LoSAP?
That's the length of service award program for volunteer firefighters.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Councilor Fishbein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am staying on page 27. Do we have the correspondence from the actuary as far as the numbers, why they're directing, that kind of stuff?
Yes,
Is that something that you can provide to us?
sure.
I think we've gotten it in the past. I just, following along with what Councilor Turner was asking, the 30% increase to that line seems quite large there in a one-year increment.
Well, for number, if I may, Councilman, that evaluation is only done every other year, if I'm correct, Jim. So therefore, that's really a two-year evaluation every other year by the actuary. So if it were done every year, because it's such a small amount figuratively in the overall scheme of it, we don't have the actuaries, we don't incur the actuarial cost every year to evaluate just that portion, just that plan, if you will. So it's done every other year. So if
Even if it was
just-
15% over the 2 years, it's
that's
still
that's
a
correct.
lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. But you would have seen more catch up probably last year if we had done it each year.
Okay. The 20% of payroll, and I know Councilor Testa asked a bunch of questions about this. You had said that prior years it was 18% and 18.5%. Is this the highest percentage that we've contributed over, let's say, the last 5 years?
Yes,
And I think you said that the calculation is 20% of current payroll.
no, 20% of the budgeted payroll for 14-15.
Okay, so that's not for retirees, that's for current people that are working for the town?
That's correct, for the town and the Board of Ed.
Okay, I'd be interested to see that letter from the actuary. That's all I had. Thank you, Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman.
just to, in the
I had one other.
80s, early 90s, we were at 22%. And then it came down off of that. And for a period of time, there was no contribution, which I think that's probably not a good place to be either, because we got used to no contribution, and then the world changed, and it's been a steady increase in the hundreds of thousands every year. Unfortunately, this does not get, in my opinion, a lot of credit or recognition when we're in the midst of arbitrations or in the midst of arguments over wage increase. Because clearly, this is a sizable contribution by the town toward pension obligations, and is gone steeply up in recent years, and yet it doesn't get a lot of weight when we talk about, well, what percentage should be the increase in salary, because you can see where the increase in salary has a direct relationship with what's going to happen on the pension.
You had more?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I forgot. This line 52310, the defined contribution plan, my understanding is that this is a cushion that we're creating so that if and when we transfer over to a 401k plan, there'll be some money, some seed money. Is that accurate?
It's seed money for that, as well as to look into the viability of a DC plan.
Okay. And where are we in, because, all these contracts we see coming across our desks, I haven't seen any talk about doing some sort of a defined contribution plan.
The defined contribution would only be part of a pension negotiation, and we have extended, the pension contracts are the subject of debate and argument, renewal separately. They're individual contracts, so we have extended them for a variety of reasons, certainly one of which is we have lost a very significant individual, Terry Sullivan, and he was primarily involved with that whole subject matter. And Jim will be taking it up as we go along, but there's been a real adjustment with being able to pick up all of the work.
I understand that. And when are we suspending it until? Because obviously we're continuing to fund it, fund the cushion at least. And I know this is not the first year that we funded this cushion. So are we anticipating that next fall we're going to be addressing this, or?
We will be addressing the subject matter through, we may have to hire some expert to advise us. There's some conflicting results from going to a defined contribution. It involves factors that need to be considered and a recognition that any savings may not be immediate. But I would hope that very soon we'll be able to start that subject matter up again. And when does the first pension up for negotiation?
Well, we actually have some up now, so
Okay.
something that needs to be discussed.
Okay.
But as the mayor said, when Terry did retire, he took a lot of that information with him, the preliminary work that was done. And because it is a negotiated item, it's probably about the limit that I could say in terms of what the strategy might be.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just looking for a timeline, and I understand we might have to
But-
get some experts involved, and I would expect that you'd
Correct.
be before us with regard to that.
The police chief sent me a PowerPoint presentation that he had in his possession, and it, basically had said that for a public sector employer, that a DC plan in a DB plan, it may not be as viable as it might be in the private sector. So there's a lot of information that we need to absorb and we need to review.
Okay, thank you.
But also, just to state, Mr. Chairman and council members, that line item would also pay for any consultation that Jim might need to assist us in this matter. The line item 52310, just for the record.
Thank you. Any other questions regarding pensions, whether on page 26 or page 27? Then moving along to risk management. Any questions regarding risk management? Councilor Fishbein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at the hypertension police, and I understand that this line, as well as the one above it, are case-specific. I notice a decrease in one and an increase in the other, the fire. Is that because we had more claims in fire than we did previously, and we have less claims in police, or what do you?
That's correct.
Okay. And are those for a certain limited period of time, or is that just ongoing as part of like workers' compensation?
The current benefits that are budgeted for,
Yes.
those are ongoing.
Okay.
for
And
specific
then
claims.
is there a specific sunsetting of those benefits?
As far as the statute's concerned, people who are eligible for them, that was sunsetted in 1996. The presumption was that because of their occupation, heart and hypertension benefits were not an automatic, but the presumption was they got them because of their job. That ended in 1996, so going forward, we have seen a decrease in those benefits.
So over time, this council will probably see those lines go away?
To say go away, I don't know, that would be up to the legislature, because those benefits could come back at any time.
Yeah,
Someone
but
would
for
lobby
some
that.
statutory, but right now, given the scheme,
With the scheme, the way it's set up here, yes, those would start to decrease.
okay. That's all I had. Thank you, Mr.
That was for folks that were hired after July 1, 1996. If you were employed before, the benefit applies to you even after you're retired, spousal benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So we'd love to see it come to an end, but that may be a wish. And like Mr. Hutt said, there have been strong efforts by those two groups of employees in Hartford to not only get this benefit back, but to broaden it, so that if a public safety employee even catches a cold or catches the flu, it is assumed that he or she got it in the discharge of his or her job responsibilities. So keep your eyes open for that.
Thank you. Any other questions for risk management? Moving on to employee insurance and other benefits. Any questions? Sorry, I thought we were still on risk management. All right, insurance, property, and casualty. Anyone? That's all that's on my agenda.
Move we adjourn. Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, may I, I'm sorry, before you adjourn, can I please meet after the meeting with you, Councilman Fishbein and Councilman Russo? That's
Sure.
okay. Thank you.
Will do. All right, all those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.